Let me say right from the beginning this morning that today's message might kind of be quite heavy for some of you here because it's about the loss of dreams, about broken dreams. Because growing up, we tend to formulate a dream in our mind of some kind, don't we? A dream to get to uni one day, to marry Ms. Right or Mr. Right, enjoy some travel together. Of course, there's always a well-paying job in there somewhere as well. And then at just the right time, we dream of having a couple of kids, a boy and a girl. But what happens when that dream that you had in front of you that was so clear and compelling becomes something in the past that you've actually missed? A dream that at one point brought you so much purpose and so much identity and so much promise, suddenly it's kind of passed you by. You don't make the grade at uni and you miss out on that course, or you don't get that job that was going to form kind of your whole pathway ahead. And then the Auckland market doesn't even allow you to get that house with a backyard. I mean, just even getting a flat is hard enough. You don't meet Ms. Barbie or Mr. Ken, not by any lack of trying on your part, or you do meet Mr. Right or Ms. Right, and it turns out that he or she isn't kind of all that right for you after all. And then the dreams of having children, they're just not coming to pass. And if that's you, you're going to really identify with one of the characters in our story today, because it's a story about Hannah. And Hannah is surrounded by this hopelessness in her life. First Samuel introduces the various characters in the story and just states the problem really succinctly. It just says, Elkanah had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah did not. Simple enough statement, isn't it? But if you've been in kind of Hannah's world, you realize that it speaks volumes to what she's experiencing. Statistics tell us that 1 in every 6 couples experience infertility, increasing to 1 in 4 couples over the age of 35. And infertility is kind of the strange form of hopelessness because it's this grief of a baby someone will never know. There's no funeral, there's no flowers, there's no cards, and yet there's this death. The death of a hope, the death of this wonder of this child emerging. The realization that you will never watch your boy playing rugby, that you will never watch your girl kind of standing up, kind of delivering that awesome speech. Everything around you reminds you, again, that your dreams that you had out here just never eventuated. You come across all these children, these pregnant women, these nappy ads, and then you come to church and often it talks about like a family service, or churches can do these insensitive things like on Mother's Day, might get kind of all the mothers to stand, and if you kind of applaud them, but if you don't kind of fall into that category, you just want this kind of giant sinkhole to open up so that you can kind of sink in and disappear. In one study, 65% of women who had experienced both infertility and divorce said that their infertility ranked more painful than their divorce. In another study, women who had experienced chronic or life-threatening diseases ranked the emotional pain of infertility as similar levels to what they were feeling with terminal illness. It's huge, isn't it? And some of you are in this category. And some of you are listening actually online to this message because you heard what the topic was going to be about and you didn't want to be in the room this morning. And that's okay. Add to these broken dreams the countless men and women who long to be married, let alone have children. I received an email on Thursday night in reply to a person who knew what the topic was today. And the person wrote, "This is a very real topic this week for many men and women. I have so many friends experiencing this pain and hopelessness. So pleased you're looking at this in your series. There's also real pain, the loss of dreams for many singles in our church family who, both men and women, for whom they would have loved to have been parents. Due to not being married, this isn't an option they can even explore. Sometimes this makes it feel even harder. Unspoken pain. I'm normally pretty okay about this stuff, but this one touched my heart today, and it tells me that I have some grieving going on for myself personally, which I hadn't quite realized. I'm sharing, I suppose, so you will understand some of the feelings that can be running through this topic that not everyone is quite aware of. My heart is wondering if it's a safe place to be at church on Sunday, and in some ways I just want to hide. It's lots of pain, isn't it? All this, lots of dreams, triggers a whole lot of feelings. This hopelessness is expressed in another email I received from Chris and Ellie. It's a couple within our church. It begins with this painful story of their situation. That in December 2015, they write, we had the 12-week pregnancy scan for our first child, Rita. Found out that there was 0% chance that she could survive birth due to a development deformity. That meant her chest cavity hadn't closed and her heart and liver were growing on the outside. We decided to carry on with the pregnancy, but she died 2.5 weeks later. My wife delivered her the following week. Since then, we've gone on to have 2 more miscarriages, both around 8 weeks, first on its own, the second induced after 3 scans, each a week apart, showing no growth or heartbeat. So many of you can identify with this, can't you? There's hopelessness as it relates to children. In fact, we did a scan about hope, a few weeks ago, and we asked you this question: can you share a time when you felt particularly hopeless? And one of the most reoccurring expressions related to children. People wrote losing babies many years ago, infertility, IVF, and miscarriages, not meeting my husband until I was older, and all my younger siblings and friends were married and having children except me. Having numerous miscarriages, I felt completely hopeless about having another child. When my son died, giving birth to my first one and things going really bad. Lots and lots of stories behind each of those. And so today we come to the story of Hannah, this woman from 1 Samuel chapter 1 who's unable to have children. And perhaps as we begin, we actually need to understand the context she was in at the time, because as hard as infertility is today, we've heard, it was even a more dire situation back then. See, at that time, a person's economic status directly depended on the number of children you had. Whether you were a farming family or a maker of, shoes, the more children you had effectively meant the more employees you had in your, company, family deal. It was simply economics. You could survive. On top of that, there was no social welfare scheme. So as you grew older, if you were going to survive later on in life, you needed to have children who would provide for you. And you need to have lots of children, because the stats at that time were that 6 out of 10 kids never entered into adulthood. They never survived it. So lots of kids meant that you might be able to survive later on. And on top of all of that, there was the security of the whole nation, because at that time, birth rates were important. If you were, the tribe next to you was larger than, had a higher birth rate, therefore had a larger population growth, which meant they had a larger army. And if you were on the smaller army, you weren't in a very good place of security. And so with all that in mind, a woman's status centered on her ability to have kids. Children were seen as a matter of life and death. Those who had lots of kids were heroes in their families and communities. Those who couldn't were kind of seen as worthless, kind of a disgrace in the eyes of society, and probably as they looked in the mirror in their own eyes as well. Because children were understood to provide honor and wealth and meaning and hope. This is the context Hannah's in as she faces all these cultural, societal pressures. In addition to all that, she has this rival, a co-wife by the name of Peninnah. Throughout the Bible, whenever you find multiple marriages, you always find all this conflict. It's never painted well. That's why Scripture talks about God creating marriage between one man, one woman, because polygamy is fraught with oppression and difficulties. And sure enough, these co-wives are rivals. We read, each year Elkanah would travel to Shiloh to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of Heaven's armies at the tabernacle. On the days Elkanah presented a sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to Peninnah and each of her children. And though he loved Hannah, he would give her only one choice portion because the Lord had given her no children. Peninnah would taunt Hannah and make fun of her because the Lord had kept her from having children. Year after year, it was the same. Peninnah would taunt Hannah as they went to the tabernacle. Each time Hannah would be reduced to tears and wouldn't even eat. One commentator, Dale Davis, imagines the scene this way as Peninnah gathers her children around the dining table with Hannah present as well. Do all you children have your food? My goodness, there's just so many of you, it's hard to keep track of. Mom, Miss Hannah doesn't have any children. Sorry, dear, what was that? Miss Hannah doesn't have any children. Oh, yes, you're right. She doesn't have any children, does she? But doesn't she want children? Oh, yes, she wants children very much. Wouldn't you say so, Hannah? Would you like to have kids? Doesn't Daddy want her to have kids? Oh, certainly Daddy would like her to have kids very much, but Miss Hannah keeps on disappointing him. She just can't have kids. Well, why not? Well, why? Because God won't let her have children. Well, doesn't God love Miss Hannah? Well, I don't know. What do you think? Oh, by the way, Hannah, did you hear that I'm expecting again? Do you think you'll ever be pregnant at all in your lifetime, Hannah? Peninnah just continues to rub salt in this open wound. Did you notice that these jibes take place at the tabernacle, at the gathering of God's people? I mean, it would be wrong, be hurtful wherever it happened, but it's hard to believe, isn't it, that such behavior could ever happen at the festival of God's people, but once there was such a time. I think the names here kind of increased the tensions in the story between these two characters. Names in this culture conveyed something about who these people were and the importance of what's going on. Hannah's name means grace. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Because God has not graced Hannah with children. And in Hannah's mind, like society at that time, the cause of this is that God has closed her womb. That's the way everybody saw that situation. It's not a lot of grace. Guess what Peninnah's name means? Woman with rich hair. Isn't that like a knife going in? I mean, even Peninnah's hair is rich and stunning. She's like the whole package, representing the dreams of society. She's a baby maker and she has good looks. Good hair. I mean, the ultimate rival to Hannah. If the cultural pressures weren't enough, the rivals taunting aren't enough, Hannah's husband doesn't really understand the depth of pain that she's experiencing. Now, it's not that Elkanah is not a reasonable guy. He comes from a family of some means. At the beginning of the story, you have kind of this genealogical line, and you kind of get this idea that, you know, they are somebody, they have land, they have a home, they have a name. Interesting, Elkanah's name means God has created a son. Kind of ironic in this situation, isn't it, since Hannah has no children. And that context, that problem probably led to Elkanah taking another bride, Peninnah, so that the family line would continue. So kind of in his mind, all of his dreams have come true. In his mind, all the cultural pressure should be off poor Hannah, because, you know, they have savings and the family name will continue. Surely she can rest in this and find some peace. So he says, why are you crying, Hannah? Why aren't you eating? Why be downhearted just because you have no children? You have me. Isn't that better than having 10 sons? Elkanah is quite content, and he has every reason to be content because he doesn't have any loss of dreams here. He has both a wife to love and a wife to make children. He has no need of children from Hannah. In his mind, surely she can just be happy about the situation too. And he just sees the position, the problem from his own perspective. You know, the only other time the word downhearted in the passage is ever used elsewhere is this meaning of a grudge. It isn't so much Elkanah saying, why are you so sad, as why is your heart so bad? Elkanah thinks that Hannah's kind of carrying this grudge, a chip on her shoulder. He just doesn't get it, does he? He takes her sadness to be that she's full of spite towards him. Try to cheer up. Your infertility doesn't matter to me. Why should it matter to you? You have me. Isn't that better than 10 sons? Maybe he should have said something more like, you mean more to me than 10 sons. Just a tip there. You know, he thinks the love of a spouse should be sufficient for all of one's hopes and dreams. But that will never bring the type of hope that Hannah needs or that anyone needs today. See, while the love of a spouse and the love of children are absolutely wonderful, they can never provide us with that genuine sense of identity and purpose that our souls crave. And if we try to find these things in a relationship outside of God, we will meet only disappointment and despair. Did you notice that no one around Hannah seems to understand her pain? Some might try to help, try to cheer her up, but they have no clue as to what she's experiencing. I think a whole bunch of us here would echo that sentiment in our own stories. So each year, Hannah has gone through this whole ordeal. She comes to the temple, she comes to these gatherings with God's people, and there's just additional hurt, layer after layer. The sacrifices haven't helped. The same taunting happens year after year after year. There's all this misunderstanding. And while everyone, it seems, around her is celebrating and enjoying the festival, we find Hannah unable to eat. She faces severe depression and this emotional torment. And treating into her story is another story all about hopelessness. This is another family. It's kind of interesting because it's kind of like, well, where did that family come from in this story? See, Eli, the senior priest, had a couple of sons. Their names were Hophni and Phinehas. And they're mentioned in verse 3, and it looks like really out of place. It goes this way. Each year, Elkanah would travel to Shiloh to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of heaven's armies at the tabernacle. The priests of the Lord at that time were the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. And you go, what have they got to do with this story? And then before we have any resolution to Hannah's story, it's like the camera pans back and we're forced to read more about these priests. Now, the sons of Eli were scoundrels. Don't you love that term? Scoundrels who had no respect for the Lord or for their duties as priests. Whenever anyone offered a sacrifice, Eli's sons would send a servant over with a three-pronged fork. While the meat of the sacrificed animal was still boiling, the servant would stick the fork into the pot and demand that whatever it brought up be given to Eli's sons. All the Israelites who came to worship at Shiloh were treated this way, all of them. So the sin of these young men was very serious in the Lord's sight, for they treated the Lord's offering with contempt. Start to find the selfishness of these priests who are in charge. Later we're told of the sexual exploitation that all the women who went to the temple were exposed to. Stories like Helen Ferguson's story that we heard earlier. So this is a low point in Israel's history. It occurs at a period you can find in the book of Judges, something we're going to come to actually in a few weeks' time. It shows that without effective leadership, the whole nation, entire nation, hit rock bottom morally, ethically, and spiritually. It's why the very end of the book, it kind of sums up the context of Hannah's life. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Everyone. Even the priests did what was right in their own eyes. Utterly hopeless time for all of God's people. And you sit back and you go, well, why does the text go out of its way for us to see this? I think it wants us to grasp that Hannah isn't just experiencing her whole own hopelessness, but she sees the hopelessness of everything around her. And this mistreatment, it says to anyone and towards her, I guess this would include Hannah, has experienced a taste of this rottenness of the spiritual priestly regime. I think the text wants us to see that the way Hannah's going to step out and respond to her own situation is also in response to the hopelessness she sees in the wider community around her. So what does Hannah do? Perhaps we're going to actually find some help here because, in the study of hope again, we're finding ways of what moves us from hopelessness to hope again. What are the things that God uses in our lives, in our own context? So what happens with Hannah? We read in verse 9. Once after a sacrificial meal at Shiloh, Hannah got up and went to pray. She steps up. She gets up, she takes action, she takes initiative, and she brings this matter to God. You see, despite the hopelessness of her situation, she had remained faithful to God. There were all these voices around her that would have been calling her to cry out to the various fertility gods like Baal, who gave rain on the earth and were meant to bring, children to women. But she was rejecting all that and coming to this God who she was anchoring her life and her hope and her destiny in. And she prays. She prays. Now, right now, some of you might be thinking, oh, great, here we go. He's reminding me that, all these broken dreams in my life, and now he wants to say to me, just pray about it, as if I didn't already know about that. And I know you know that, and I am going to tell you to pray about it, but I want you to see how Hannah prays and what happens. Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. And she made this vow. O Lord of heaven's armies. O Lord of heaven's armies, she says. There's this realization for her of God's power and an immense presence around her. You know, perhaps in her mind, she's recalling the story we saw a few weeks ago when Elisha opens the servant's eyes and he sees this invisible army that was actually there all the time, but perhaps that's what she's seen too. God, you're the one who leads this invisible army. You have the power to do something here. And then she makes her request. Lord of heaven's armies, if you will look upon my sorrow. Maybe she recalls so many of the Psalms that remind us how God hears our cries. God sees our hopelessness. The Bible is full of these prayers. You hear, O Lord, the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them and you listen to their cry. Hannah's recalling that this one who is Lord of heaven's armies is also the God who does not ignore the cries of the heart or the desire of the afflicted. She believes that she matters to this God and he will listen to this, even this one woman who has been largely ignored by others, but God will not ignore her. And she comes to this God who is absolutely great, but also tender, powerful, but personally present with her. And so she takes the deepest hurt and her pain. She doesn't hide them, but she brings them to this God of hope and she releases the weightiness of what she's feeling. If you look upon my sorrow and answer my prayer and give me a son, then I will give him back to you. He will be yours for his entire lifetime, and as a sign that he has been dedicated to the Lord, his hair will never be cut. After recalling who God is and realizing the weightiness of her heart and mind, she does something else. She makes this vow. And when she makes this vow, she's not bargaining with God. It's not like, God, if you give me something, I'll give something back to you. It might kind of sound like that. But I think what's going on here is she is actually prompted by what she sees around her and this evilness and the hopelessness of society. And she wants to be an agent of hope herself. And the contrasting story, everyone else apparently is doing what's right in their own eyes. But here's Hannah. I think she's acting very differently to everyone else because this isn't actually just about her. What she's doing here actually will not benefit her. If God gives her a son, she's saying, I will dedicate him as a Nazirite. And a couple of the marks of these Nazirites were they wouldn't drink alcohol, they wouldn't cut their hair, would kind of set them apart for service in the temple of God. Perhaps she's saying, God, if you give me a son, I will make him one of those priests, and perhaps he will change the whole priestly order that is just so evil. Immediately, that request means that if she has a son, her cultural dreams won't be realized. Because economically, this boy won't be able to take care of Hannah in her old age. Emotionally, she won't be able to show him off to others. There won't be any rugby games to look at in the future. There won't be her sitting around the table with Peninnah's, all her kids with her boy next to her. That's not going to happen for her. I think her reason is more theological. You see, like all Israelite women, Hannah knew that God had given this promise that the seed of Abraham, the children of Abraham would be used by God to bring blessing to the world. That every time, a child was born through that whole nation, they were bringing something around God's promise. Perhaps Hannah remembers that there's a whole range of women who suffered infertility before her that God used. Like Sarah, the wife of Abraham. As a couple, they had this promise that God was going to bless them with a son. And they waited and waited and waited with this dark cloud of infertility. And then Sarah finally conceives and has a son at the age of 90 named Isaac. Isaac grows up, he meets Rebekah. But it took 25 years of marriage before twins Jacob and Esau came along. Jacob married Leah and Rachel, and there's like all these soap opera antics around Rachel's infertility before Joseph is born. This is how the nation of Israel begins, with all these issues, all this hopelessness. Maybe she remembers all this. Perhaps she remembers even just in the recent history how there was another barren couple and they prayed and Samson was born and he was a Nazirite and he was able to bring some peace to Israel. And here's Hannah as she looks at her own life and she looks around the whole nation and she sees the hopelessness that's there. And I think she's kind of coming and just saying, God, if you would bless me with a son, I want to hand him back to you, that he would be an agent of hope to lead our whole nation back to you. She sees the appalling hopelessness around her. With all this happening, Eli the priest was watching, and because he's kind of guarding the tabernacle, and this is what we read. As she was praying to the Lord, Eli watched her, seeing her lips moving but hearing no sound. He thought she had been drinking. Must you come here drunk? He demanded. Throw away your wine. And how's that for pastoral compassion? You know, she's so brokenhearted. She can't even get the words out because of this deep grief inside. And the leading spiritual leader of God's people says, go home and sober up. It doesn't say a whole lot about the quality of spiritual leadership. Eli can't even distinguish between a heartfelt prayer and the slurring, muttering of a drunk. But Hannah doesn't become bitter. She said, oh no, sir, she replied. I haven't been drinking wine or anything stronger, but I am very discouraged as I was pouring out my heart to the Lord. Don't think I'm a wicked woman, for I've been praying out of great anguish and sorrow. He's probably caught off guard. In that case, go in peace. May the God of Israel grant the request you have asked of him. Oh, thank you, sir. And she went back, began to eat again. She was no longer sad. Nothing's changed in her context at this point. But now she's eating. Now she's kind of content of her situation. She's released the weightiness of it all over to God. She's poured out the matter to God, and she's choosing to place her life and her future in the hands of a God of hope. Again, she's not pregnant in this stage, but we read that God steps in and gives her a son. The entire family got up early the next morning, went to worship the Lord once more. They returned home to Ramah. When Elkanah slept with Hannah, the Lord remembered her plea, and in due time she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, which is kind of like this sound of a word that means, to ask or request. She names him Samuel, for she said, I asked the Lord for him. And we see what God continues to do as we cry out to him. This God of hope steps in and moves us from hopelessness to hope again. In fulfillment of her vow, she brings Samuel to the temple, likely just a boy of 4 or 5 years old, and she dedicates him. And then chapter 2 of 1 Samuel is the song that she sings, not at Samuel's birth, but at his dedication, because again, what the desire of her heart is not just to have a son, but to see hope brought for the nation. And the song kind of echoes all of that, this desire she has for God to do something special and bring hope to other people. Hannah prays, my heart rejoices in the Lord has made me strong. Now I have an answer for my enemies. I rejoice because the Lord has rescued me. No one is holy like the Lord. There's no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. She recalls again who God is and her identity anchored in this God. And then she sings about how God reverses situations and destinies. She says, stop acting so proud and haughty. Don't speak with such arrogance, for the Lord is a God who knows what you have done. He will judge your actions. The bow of the mighty is now broken, and those who stumbled are now strong. And she starts talking about all this kind of reversal going on. Those who are well fed are now starving, and those who were starving are now full. The childless woman now has 7 children, and the woman with many children wastes away. The Lord makes some poor and others rich. He brings some down and lifts others up. He lifts the poor from the dust and the needy from the garbage dump. He sets them among princes, placing them in seats of honor. He gives power to his king, increases the strength of his anointed one. See, Hannah's hope is in a God who is able to reverse destinies, to make the weak strong, to satisfy the hungry, to bring resources to the poor and the oppressed, to bring fortune to a fertile woman. It's the one who can turn situations completely around in surprising ways. And all this is linked, I think, to something Hannah sees, something we can kind of gloss over. Did you notice right at the end of her song, she says, he gives power to his king. But there is no king in Israel at this point. I wonder if Hannah has this inkling that her son is going to have a role in setting up this kingdom. I wonder again if this whole time, again, as she's been praying to be an agent of hope to the city, that her son is going to be part of that. Did she know that her son would actually be the one who would anoint King David? the one who would bring hope to people and through whom ultimately Jesus Christ, the King of Kings, would come? Did you know that her very situation would be used by God to bring hope in ways that nobody would think possible? You see, ultimately Hannah is part of this bigger dream of God, a dream where people are renewed, where gatherings of God's people are filled with authenticity and encouragement and hope, where people are able to hope again because God, this powerful God, is present, this God who was a reverser of destinies. See, that's why we can hope again. You see, I've the joy of being around modern day Hannahs in our church. People who have chosen to hope again, even when their context looks so hopeless. You know, one couple is Chris and Ali. I read the beginning of an email they sent to me earlier about the loss of their daughter, followed by 2 further miscarriages. And the email was actually part of this 4-page reflection entitled My Thoughts on Hope in God. I won't read it all to you, but I want to read a little bit. You can ask for a copy of the paper out at the reception desk after the service if you'd like to. This is what they write. It's kind of answering this question, what is it that we hope for? I think the answer is God's presence, his continuing, unchanging, ever faithful presence. The goal of our life as faith is to learn to rely on that one fact and that alone, not on an outcome. Not that our earthly lives will work out in the end, not that pain will just go away and everything will be how we want them or at least tolerable. At the end of the incredible list of faithful followers in the book of Hebrews, the writer makes it clear that none of them received all that God had promised them. The Bible is full of faithful people who didn't get what they wanted. David's baby still died. Jeremiah still saw his nation destroyed and he was still carried away. Moses never entered the promised land. How many Christians over the past 2,000 years have ever wanted easier lives with different outcomes than what was promised, than what was provided? But whether they could see it or not, God's presence was always there. And so with that in mind, Chris and Ali anchored their lives into this God who invites them to a bigger dream. And right now, they're celebrating that Ali is 20 weeks pregnant. And they're celebrating God's goodness to them thus far in the pregnancy. But these words were written in the context of their pain, choosing to hope again. Another modern day Hannah is a young married woman that I'll call Samantha. She too emailed me her story recently and the story of her recently married husband. She writes, I don't get to church often these days because of my health. But when I come, I feel refreshed and encouraged by the messages. My current circumstances should not call for a sense of hope as we look down the barrel of my next surgery, being a hysterectomy. Last Friday afternoon, I signed the documents to agree to a hysterectomy within the next 5 months. Although it was with sadness and grief that I made this decision, it's also one filled with hope and peace, knowing that God has this. And whatever hurt and pain comes through this life will be gone so quickly when Jesus returns. The message yesterday brought all of this to the forefront of my mind as I sat there on Mother's Day knowing that I had just made the decision 2 days earlier to never bear my own children. See, on the surface, this is heavy. The dreams she once had aren't going to eventuate in the way that she dreamed. But she hopes again in a bigger story. She goes on. I reflect on the scripture that says, "For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed." This is my hope. This is my blessing as the times get tougher and the days get darker and faster. Although there is pain, there is also gladness and hope. That's courageous. So stories like Samantha's, like Chris and Ali's, like Helen Ferguson that we heard earlier. People within our church that are anchoring their life and their hope in this God who is the reverser of destinies, a God who is able to bring people out of hopelessness to hope again and lead us to become agents of hope to others. In this God, one finds a love greater than any spouse can ever deliver, a greater identity than any of us can ever experience as a mum or dad, a greater purpose beyond our wildest dreams. And God looks at you today and says, I love you more than 10 sons or $1 billion. I love you. It's the hope that Peter words this way. In his great mercy, he has given us a new birth into a living hope and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. I wonder if we can close our eyes and just reflect on that for a moment as we pray. You know, perhaps you're here and you're just trying to look at the situation in front of you, and you just need the Spirit of God to remind you of hope today. And if that's you, I just encourage you to just place your hand over your heart. As a way of saying, Spirit of God, I need you to heal this broken heart of mine, to renew me from the inside out. It's kind of a way of identifying that you need to release something to God. Of course, it might be that some of you here today haven't kind of crossed that line of faith toward Jesus, and perhaps this is your time to say, God, this is my life. I've been chasing after all sorts of other things in this identity rush and trying to find something else, but I actually need to find your hope. Need to find your hope and need to find an identity and a purpose and a security outside of me, because where I'm looking has not delivered. So Jesus, here we are. There's a lot of hurt in this room. A lot of broken dreams. Dreams that somehow passed us by. Thank you that you are the reverser of destinies. Think of the way you stepped into such hopelessness as you entered this world. It's all its evilness and hopelessness. And you took upon yourself the scars, the cross, the death, the tomb, the darkness. And then you overcame it all, bringing hope to failure, bringing hope to fear and heartache and pain and burdens. And so here we are, Jesus. We ask that you would knit us together again. We ask that you would help us to be agents of hope to others. Help us, Jesus, to hope again. In Jesus' name, amen.